A lot of that stuff is wrapped up in the film, but presented in a way that we feel is a little bit more palatable.
This is the moment that I knew that the adaptation of The Electric State was not gonna work. So a couple of days ago, I watched The Electric State, and although there were aspects of the movie that I really enjoyed, I was quite frankly unsurprised by its failure in capturing the essence of the source material. You see, whether or not an adaptation works is completely dependent on the soul argument. If you can recapture the soul of the source material, you're basically halfway there in creating a great adaptation. But that's the problem though, isn't it? What exactly is the soul of a story? Think about it like this. An adaptation is like translating a language. More often than not, a lot of nuances and subtleties of the language get lost in translation. But when you try to understand the concept on a fundamental level, you can retell your version of the story in your language without diminishing the reality of the original. And in an adaptation, these subtleties are exactly what translates to what is known as the soul. And the thing is, it isn't something that you can measure or quantify. It's not like you can add a touch of soul during post-production. It doesn't work that way. In its basic form, it is an emergent property. Something that arises from the perfect harmony of various elements like acting and cinematography and pacing and narrative structures and even the philosophies. And this is the problem with The Electric State. When the story got adapted to the screen, well, they left behind its soul. Let's start off with the aesthetics. I feel like people tend to think that beautiful visuals equals a great adaptation. And although great visuals can elevate a sentence from a book, it's not necessarily the prettiness of the visual, but rather the reason for the visual that makes the scene great.
I think people confuse pretty with good cinematography. What was it Freddie Francis says? There was good cinematography and bad cinematography, and then there's the cinematography that's right for the movie.
And that's the thing here. Although the visuals in this movie are quite good most of the time, it's not really consistent with itself, nor the paintings of Simon Stalenhag. In the book, these dystopian landscapes are moody and ominous. It's almost like every artwork has this foreboding quality to it, that every time you turn the page, there is a lurking horror that emerges from within. It's hard to explain the feeling, but I tend to think that it's atmospheric. Something strange about these environments, the uneasy blue tinge of the fog, everything about it seems sickly and inescapable. But in the adaptation, there doesn't seem to be a desire to recapture this feeling. And it's not like they didn't understand the fundamentals here. In fact, there are a couple of shots that do justice to the source material. It fits in with the aesthetic. It's not just a beautiful shot, but a shot that replicates the feeling of the book. But the problem is, these shots are few and far between. It's not nearly enough to convey the feeling of these paintings. Even some of the shots within the desert. Just look at how these two identical frames make you feel different things. Which one do you think looks more ominous? The one with the extra layer of atmosphere that portrays a sandstorm, or the other where you can clearly see a nice background behind the characters? Based on the thematic elements, this is a movie that should look very much similar to a film like Blade Runner 2049, but it looks more like a Marvel movie. The bleakness of the world building is completely lost within these visuals. And sticking with the cinematography, I feel like they missed a trick within the camera as well. When you film a dystopian environment, there should be some emphasis on the landscapes. The lifeblood of a dystopia is indeed its world building. And when you create compositions that fail to justify this aspect, it won't feel like a dystopia. And I keep referencing Blade Runner 2049 because I feel like it was the perfect movie to draw inspiration from. Look at how Denis Villeneuve and Roger Deakins framed some of the shots from Blade Runner. They isolated the people within these ginormous compositions. There are wide-angled frames where the backgrounds are towering over the characters, and from this arises a personality to the world building. They don't tell you why it's a dystopia, but through these compositions, they show you. And from the graphic novel, you can tell that this is the perspective of the story. The art is deliberately wide-angled to give you a sense of scale. The compositions make it seem like you are viewing these metallic monstrosities through the eyes of an adventurer. And that is another problem with the adaptation. There aren't enough frames that give you that sense of scale. Even when they portray these structures, they don't put nearly enough emphasis on them to showcase how big they are from the human perspective. It seems like these objects are just stashed away in the backgrounds as pointless things. In almost all of these paintings, the subject is the weird structures in the background. The car passing by is not really that relevant. But if you take a look at the movie, these structures don't really give you that feeling. And then there is the pacing. This is a graphic novel based on a girl's adventure across the empty landscapes of a dystopian America. So you would think that a world devoid of life, a story told in isolation, would naturally be slowed down to fit the narrative structure. But not really. I kinda understand why filmmakers go with a faster pacing. Just look at all the highest grossing movies out there. Probably 90% of them are fast-paced movies. But sometimes, when the source material is blatantly showing you the pacing of the narrative, maybe just go with it. This was not one of those movies where you were supposed to chop through the visuals. You were meant to sit there and take in the environment. That's the whole point of these paintings, to let the audience absorb the visuals.
If we hold this shot a bit longer, maybe it'll mean something else. Maybe the audience go, why are we holding this shot? What's going to happen? You build a tension through the use of the shot, the frame, and just little camera movements.
They could have added thoughtful, ponderous shots with minimal camera movement. That would have helped in conveying an effective dystopian setting. But instead, the pacing is kind of similar to a superhero movie. There's action around every corner and some kind of music playing in every other scene. It doesn't allow you to get a feel for the world, and that's the difference between an average sci-fi flick and a sci-fi masterpiece. And the dialogues are another problem. You see, the book is a classic example of show, don't tell. It's not a book filled with intricate dialogue structures. The dialogue is very minimal and sparingly used just to signify the human presence within the world building. It is very much intentional. But the adaptation completely went the opposite direction. It's just that a lot of it is incredibly unnecessary for this narrative. Why do you need so many characters and so much filler dialogue? It fully takes away the immersion of the story. And again, the comical bits feel straight out of a Marvel movie, not something that fits with the eerie aesthetic of the book. This was one of those movies that could have done with moments of silence. Scenes where the characters are trying to process what has become of their world. The bleakness of humanity could have been portrayed through the lack of dialogue, but instead... But if the soul of the original wasn't gone until now, it is the philosophy of the adaptation that completely puts it to rest. While reading the book, I always felt that this was a story about hyper-consumerism and how the consumers got consumed by the technology that was supposed to serve them. But in the adaptation, they're a bit less focused on this aspect. Although they do bring up these topics at several points in the plot, they never really explore them. They're just kinda there. And instead, the focus is on the war between the robots and humans, which is a story that is painfully overdone in Hollywood, by the way. And again, even towards the end, when Michelle goes on this monologue, it points towards a happy ending, where her words are about to inspire change within this world. It is a hopeful ending. It is an inspiring ending. But that's the other missed opportunity here. The Electric State is grim and dark for a purpose. It is not a hopeful story, but rather a cautionary tale on the progression of the world. It's a story that slaps the Oculus Rift off of your head, not one that makes you feel one with it. In the book, the art becomes darker and darker as we approach the ending. There is a painting where a gigantic drone stands on the road within a dark atmosphere, its body connected through wires to the cult-like people who follow it. Their neurocasters emitting a reddish glow through the fog. Is a picture that paints 1,000 words, but at this point in the story, it is symbolically meaningful. But none of this dark side of hyper-consumerism and technology is portrayed within the movie. It struggles to extract the same feelings from the audience. There is an overlap within the morals, that's for sure, but not the impact of the original. The philosophies are watered down to fit this exact word. And whenever I hear this word, I roll my eyes because I know the adaptation will struggle to have a soul. And it's also funny that they spent an alleged $320 million for this movie. And I will say, there might be a lot of visual effects shots that would have eaten up a lot of that budget, and some of them are pretty good. But it's almost like they created a mockery of the source material. Here's a book about hyper-consumerism, and how do we do it justice in the adaptation? Well, let's spend an unimaginable sum of money to capture the essence of the philosophy. Honestly, at this point, it has to be satire, right? There's no way they couldn't understand the moral of the original story. At the end of the day, if you have never read the book, the movie might actually pass for an average sci-fi flick that you might enjoy if there's nothing interesting to watch. But as an adaptation, although they tried, they struggled to capture the soul. And for the most part, the adaptation completely missed the point.